Okay, yeah, we're live. Okay, well, hey, this is Real Sankara Hours podcast. I'm Adam Hudson, my
Um,
co-host.
I'm Peter MGunn. And yeah, we're here to bring you the real shit, and to black
Yeah,
liberalism and
yes,
all those things.
yes, pretty much. We're pretty much like if you're sick of like the kind of conventional black liberal political thought, listen to us because we're an antidote to that, basically. So I guess a little bit about the both of us, since this is our first episode, our first episode into the podcast market ecosystem. I'm Adam Hudson. I'm a freelance journalist and musician. A lot of my stuff is at Truth Out, Alternate, The Nation, other progressive outlets. A lot of stuff I write about is Guantanamo, policing, gentrification, U.S. foreign policy. Um, and yeah, I just finished graduate school. I have an MFA in nonfiction writing from University of San Francisco,
Go.
and
What are they? What are they again?
they're the Dons.
Go
Dons.
Dons.
Yeah, I'm not particularly excited about that mascot. It's Jesuit University.
Right.
Um,
Uh,
yeah, go ahead.
okay. I'm Peter MGunn. I guess that's what we're going with. No need to throw the government out there since most of my writing is done under that name. Um, I'm currently in Portland, Maine, the whitest state in America. For some reason, don't ask me why I'm here. Um,
Why are you
I,
there?
oh my God, I'm still figuring that out. Ostensibly, I'm working on a novel, or also trying. I was initially a freelance writer, I suppose, though not. I did not nearly get paid for as many things as you did. Um,
Yeah, the payment for freelancing is notoriously not that great, and that's
so
putting it mildly.
so now I'm just a line cook and all around internet degenerate, tanky asshole. Um, and you know, we're. Do you want to talk about maybe sort of, I guess, your like political evolution and I guess how we linked up in the first place?
Sure, yeah, that's actually that's a good idea. Yeah, my political evolution. Uh, well, I can't really pin it down to one particular event. It's more of like a sort of slow rolling evolution. I mean, I grew up in a very I live in Pittsburgh, California. It's about 20 minutes outside of Oakland, where I was born. Um, I was raised in a pretty, I'd say, um, black household in a sense. Like I was always very steeped in black culture and um, thinking. And so, right around I'd say the Bush 2000 election and 9/11, that's when I really started paying attention to the news more. And I was a teenager then, so it's like that stuff was happening. Being a teenager, trying to figure yourself out. So on the one hand, I was figuring out my black identity, but also paying attention to the world around me, particularly the Iraq War, and trying to pretty much make sense of myself and the world around me. So yeah, and then when I went to Stanford University, which is where Peter and I met as college students,
So not.
I got.
I don't think technically when we were actually students.
Oh, you're right. I think yeah. I mean, well, we crossed paths, but we met. I think officially. Yeah, you're right. Like I think after. Yeah. Um. Yeah. Like so at Stanford, I was involved in a lot of like. I was involved in the NAACP and anti-war activism, and so I think like a lot of my politics are pretty much centered in black liberation and a critique of um, economic inequality and capitalism, because where I grew up in Pittsburgh was it's largely blue collar, working class, and mostly non-white, and then Stanford is the complete opposite. So balancing between those worlds, I that's when I really started diving into stuff like Marx and trying to make sense of how economic inequality works and how that ties with racism and imperialism and all that. So I guess like that's kind of my political evolution in a nutshell, and uh, I guess self-identify, which is weird because it's like you ever are you ever like in leftist spaces and they're like, "What's your political ideology?" It's like, how do you identify politically? It's like it's this weird little sort of ritual that we do. So
Yeah, you do have to feel people out sometimes though, because
yeah,
most people it doesn't matter, but when you're in like those circles, it's good to just know where people are coming from.
right,
But
yeah.
it
So
is weird because you
yeah,
because you go through like five different things, especially in your
oh
20s.
oh, absolutely, yeah. So I would say like for the most part, what I've settled on is like I'm basically politically pan-African socialist, pan-African leftist, um and I see pan-Africanism as like, essentially seeing all people of African descent as essentially one people and sharing the same fate, collective fate. um and my sense of politics is uh, largely centered on that concern, but also a concern for other marginalized people who suffer under the boot of white supremacy. So other people of color, both within America and overseas as well. So yeah, that's pretty much my intellectual tradition, so to speak.
Okay, yeah, cool. I grew up in well, I was born in Hillsdale, Michigan, which is an extreme hotbed of reactionary thinking, but I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in what some people termed the hood, but it never really felt that way when I was growing up. I mean, it was generally like a working class. It's actually a pretty integrated neighborhood, but it was sort of like on the border of places that were more seen as the ghetto, I guess. Like if you crossed the major street, then it was like there were like streets that were 2 or 3 blocks from me where people were like, I would never cross that street type situation. Basically, um, went to urban Columbus public schools, which was pretty notorious for being bad at the time. That typical kind of urban school model. I always felt kind of weird in the sense of like, because I guess I lived like in a black neighborhood. Like a lot of the kids around me were black, but and I went to like, well, mostly black schools, but um, we like all my extracurriculars were like with white people, and
Mm.
I guess I was, it was also I was very confused about, I guess, my mixed race identity until uh like 16 or 17 when I started doing anti-racism work with the Unitarian Church that I grew up in. And this was like way before Tumblr and all that stuff. So
Oh yeah.
I really was like on the ground floor and was learning about white privilege and systematic racism and all that stuff, institutional racism and stuff, when they were still like radical concepts and hadn't been thoroughly colonized by Democrats and corporations and stuff. And I think that's actually weirdly one of the reasons I got into Stanford. But all you know, also growing up during the Iraq War, that definitely had a big effect on me. But my parents were pretty solid Democrats. Um, you know, NPR was always playing Um, soak that stuff in. I was pretty apolitical during college. Um, I just kind of took that period off, I guess. I don't know. I wasn't a great student, but I made it out with an English degree and no idea of what I wanted to do. So I basically like hung around for another year, and that was right when Occupy Wall Street started.
And
And
I think that's where you and
yeah,
I crossed paths,
yeah,
was around
that's
Occupy.
where we
Yeah.
ran into each other. I don't even remember like specifically what it was, but it's like an Occupy meeting or something. And then I think I found your blog, and
Yeah.
um, then we I guess started talking, and then we were in a band for a year. Uh,
Yeah.
I had to lug my amp all the way on the BART, which was fun. Um,
Those were the days.
yeah, but Occupy really gave me, I really feel like that was the first part of like sort of the political awakening that's gotten us to this point in terms of,
Yeah.
before that, people like didn't talk about capitalism at all. You
Yeah.
know, it was all like corporate power and stuff like that. But
Yeah, and I remember like cuz my degree is in international relations and I took a lot of poli sci and econ classes. And this was so I graduated in 2010 and the crash happened the beginning of my junior year of college. And I remember around that time like there was a shift. Like I remember when I first got to Stanford, like my freshman and sophomore year, everyone was like, a lot of people were like, especially if you were doing econ or anything related,
oh
the
god,
sort of the hip jobs were like consulting, investment banking, stuff like that. Then when the crash hit, people were like, okay, we're not going to do those jobs anymore. Like it was not as sexy to be in an investment banking right when the crash hit. So there was
yeah,
definitely there was definitely a real shift in terms of
everyone started working for Facebook.
right. Yeah. Well, yeah, because Facebook, I think, well, during that, I'd say between 2008 to 2011, I think that's when there is a shift from like that sort of emphasis on iBanking to tech. And so, like, in between that time, the period I'm talking about, like, there was a sort of a vacuum that needed to be filled that I think tech filled in culturally that iBanking previously filled. But during that period, it was a big, huge shift in terms of what people had to think about the economy and capitalism. And that was, Bush. That was the end of the Bush term, and he left office pretty much in disrepute. And I feel like people forget that. That like one of the main reasons why Obama got elected is people hated Bush.
They were
Like he was,
so just done with anything Republican.
and this is important to consider now with Trump because everyone's like anybody but Trump. It's like, well, we've seen this script before with Bush. Like there was this huge like the Republican, and I remember back then people were like, the Republican Party is dead, it's over because of Bush and Cheney and da 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 da. Because people finally, I mean, like when the Iraq War first was announced, like I was against it because back then I was like, why are we
Everyone with half a functioning brain was against it. I mean,
right? Yeah, yeah, and there were and there so finally much of the country realized that like yeah the WMDs and then the connection to 9/11 like the justifications for the Iraq War, which was one, Saddam Hussein had connections to Al Qaeda 9/11, which wasn't true, and then the other one was like, oh, he has like nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, also proven to not be true. Once the
yeah,
country realized that, then there was Hurricane Katrina, then there was the revelation about the CIA torture program in Guantanamo. There is just scandal and fuckery after fuckery in the Bush administration that people were so fed up that like, yeah, we'll go with Barack Obama, like a black dude with a
yeah,
funny name who's talking about hope, and people went with that, and I
yeah,
think like that's something important to consider now because I think particularly with this never Trump mania, I think like there's a lack of historical memory. Like people forget that like yeah, okay, just because you're so pissed at the Republicans, that that doesn't mean you have to sort of let your guard down when it comes to the Democratic Party. And
Yeah,
and I think the real lesson here is like it's really fucking important to scrutinize these Democratic candidates, which will segue into what we're going to be
yeah.
talking about.
If I may continue
Yeah.
though,
Oh, sorry.
um, yeah,
I'm
it's
sorry. Sort of bogarted that.
no, it's my, I guess I have a tendency where like I like will set up something and then I have a pause and then other people will then jump in. That I suppose is not entirely media friendly, but after, so going through Occupy was a pretty, it was a profoundly radicalizing experience, specifically because and this is another thing I think people forgot about when it happened, because they think we're just like, oh, it was a failure, it didn't do anything. But the entire like state apparatus mobilized to crush it. And
Yep.
like when they disassembled those camps, it was like literally thousands of cops showed up
Oh yeah.
um in New York or LA, in basically every city. Like hundreds or thousands of cops showed up. You know, I was almost in J28, which was this protest in Oakland in 2012. They arrested 400 people, and I was almost one of those people. Um, and the other thing that it really kind of ingrained in me was like the at that point, I guess I considered myself an anarchist, but I had a lot of questions about how anarchism can really be organize effectively against the state. So after that kind of died down, I spent a year in San Francisco trying to be like an anti-tech journalist or something. Um, you it was actually because of you. You got me my only paid journalism gig, and that's actually when I realized I can't. I never really want to. I can't really do reporting because I don't
Yeah,
like
it's
talking to
tough.
strangers. But I was doing that, basically getting paid $50, to write an article a month for
Yep.
this like youth radio public media thing, and doing like TaskRabbit type stuff. And then that kind of fell through. And also, basically, all my friends that were in San Francisco moved out because I call it like I was, I guess, like doing a trustafarian thing without a trust fund. But like all
So
the,
so just to put a timestamp,
yeah,
this is around like 2013. Like what
yeah,
year was this that you're
2012,
talking about?
2013.
Okay.
Um, and then I moved back to Columbus and basically, you know, got a job, started delivering pizza in my old neighborhood, which, let me tell you something, delivering pizza to your old high school will definitely mess up your ego.
Oh man.
And especially when your like face is like on the wall as like national merit something. But
Mm.
um and while doing that, I was writing at like one of the alternative newspapers. I had like a, well, paper started out weekly, then it went monthly. I had a column in there. Um and really, I spent 2 years doing that, and that was really when a lot of things crystallized, because that was like the first time I really, sort of understood like the like physical reality of like wage labor and like having your surplus value extracted, and like all those sort of abstract concepts really became clear to me like right in front of me. And also driving around in my old neighborhood, I mean, there are some places. Columbus is like not a Rust Belt city, and it's like it's around that, in the past, in that decade, it really like grew and became like more like an Austin type like hip city, but or
Mm.
at least it thought it was. I mean, I still like it, but Um, there were also just parts that were completely neglected, and sort of simmering in that, you know, really kind of made me dive deeper into like Marxism specifically, and then like the actual history of communism, and putting things together, and the broader U.S. imperial apparatus, and this is also when Ferguson was popping up and all that stuff, and so that was when I basically officially called myself a Marxist Leninist, and that's still how I identify today. So that's a problem. I guess don't listen to us, but um, you know, most Marxist Leninists, I don't know. I feel like we get a bad reputation, but we're all nice people. We're not gonna gulag you unless you're. I mean, unless you're like fucking Dick Cheney, okay? But like, you know, most people, it's fine.
uh, I think, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Occupy because, yeah, like I remember, like, because I was working at the Nation, I interned at the Nation in 2012, and that was a year after the first, Occupy encampment at Zuccotti Park in Manhattan. And even around then, some people were saying, "Oh, Occupy is dead," and there was like a kind of a 1 year sort of anniversary encampment there. But I do think like the reason why Bernie Sanders is as popular as he is now is because of Occupy. Because Occupy, well, there was a recession, and then Occupy was that reaction to it. Because I think the 2008 recession, I think, opened up the underlying contradictions in the shaky foundation of capitalism, particularly the sort of Reaganite Clinton neoliberal capitalism that was pretty much the dogma of the 80s and the 90s and much of the 2000s.
Yeah.
And that whole foundation, that whole edifice just came crashing like a stack of cards, right?
Well, yeah,
And now is
it got revealed for the global derivatives market,
yeah,
which was like $700 trillion. I mean,
yeah.
that instability, and like you know the whole thing is basically built on sand and can collapse at any moment, and it's basically held together by people's belief that this is the only system that can exist. I mean, I don't think people quite realized exactly how catastrophic everything could have been.
Oh
um,
yeah.
and that
And
system isn't really, it's still basically the same. I mean, Dodd
and
Frank didn't really do anything.
no, and not even just Dodd Frank, but Obama's response to the recession was like just putting a band-aid on it when you needed, like, I don't know, open heart surgery or something.
Hmm.
So, and I think because of Obama's, like, the recovery wasn't really a full recovery because a lot of the jobs, the post-recession jobs, are a lot of them are contract labor, part-time labor, temp labor, and a lot of jobs that are, used to be conventionally middle class are even more insecure than before. I mean, look at higher education, right? With professors,
Yeah.
a huge chunk of the faculty workforce at 4 year universities, even down to community college, most are adjuncts, and you're getting paid like semester by semester, like barely salaried. And there are some adjunct professors I've read that like have to basically live in their cars or resort to sex work in order to make ends meet. So
Yeah.
the so
Which
Obama.
I should say that like
Mhm.
I obviously have plenty of criticisms of the material function of academia, but I think when people go after academics sort of in a reactionary fashion, they need to remember that like most academics, especially ones like speaking anything leftist politics, like are not, tenured six-figure professors. I mean,
Right, exactly.
they're basically working minimum wage jobs.
And it's similar with journalism. I mean, my profession. I mean, like I'm a freelance journalist, right? And I teach on the side in order to pay the bills. And so there are. I mean, I've heard so many stories of friends of mine, colleagues, peers in journalism who like have had to experience layoffs and a perpetual cycle of it, unstable employment in journalism. And it's like, we talk so much, particularly in the Trump era, about the importance of getting truth out. Well, how the hell can you report the truth when much of the journalism workforce is, again, part-time contract labor, right?
Yeah.
So that this is, and
Or there's like the Columbia J School people. I mean, there's like the small amount of people who get the New York Times jobs or whatever, but those people like have to come from backgrounds where they can afford the money to go to
yeah,
Columbia J School, and then 2 years of internships. So there really is like a class divide among
oh,
like
yeah.
the journalist class. Is not the same kind of profession it was like 40 years ago.
Right, yeah, and a lot of like, there's also like unpaid to low paid internships you have to do in journalism to get your foot in the door at those publications. So like, if you don't come from a particular class background or even a racial background, right? Because especially if you're black, you're not coming from generations of intergenerational wealth, largely as a result of
Yeah.
slavery and institutional racism. So you're already like, at a deficit at that end. And so the Obama administration like was largely a very very weak response to a catastrophic economic mess, right? And I think like particularly some of the I think that really provided a lot of the left populist energy that you see in someone like Bernie Sanders and why he's so popular, because the reality for so many people in this country is that of real widespread economic insecurity, stagnant wages, insecure employment, on top of a very, very bloated private health insurance system that basically condemns
Is
people to death
absolute
because
trash.
it condemns people to death because they do not have enough money to pay these insurance companies and also the greedy hospitals as well. So, and I think that's one thing important to keep in mind when it comes to Sanders, because Sanders' rise didn't come in a vacuum. Like I don't think it was just like Sanders, he's
No.
been, yeah, he's clearly
And
been in the game for a long time, but
yeah.
he's popular because of Occupy put anti-capitalist thinking on the map in a way that did not exist before. It's certainly like these critiques of capitalism that we're hearing now did not exist in the 2000s. You sure as fuck could not say it in the 90s, especially under
Yeah.
Clinton, right? So it took this crash in 2008, then the Occupy movement, and also the pretty much the very weak response of the Obama administration to respond to particularly the homeowners who were severely crushed by the
Yeah.
foreclosure crisis. Even where I live, Pittsburgh, California, like it was one of the
Yeah. I
Pittsburgh,
mean,
Antioch, they were hit hard.
Wells
Particularly,
Fargo alone foreclosed on like 2 million houses.
yeah,
And so that was my justification for not paying them on the stupid credit card they shouldn't have given me when I was 18.
right.
Um, but yeah, and now, and like, I think things are even coming out now where it was like Obama, like, basically had Citigroup pick his cabinet for him.
Yeah,
Um, and like, you know, like Congress was willing to bail out the homeowners instead of the banks. Um, like they basically laid that out to Obama um, before like basically when it was clear that he was going to win. And I'll see if I can. I think this was on True and On, um, where they were talking about this. But
we can
basically,
probably. Sorry,
yeah.
we can probably put it in like the show notes or something
Yeah.
later on, like after we finish. So
But basically, they were like Bush had signed off on that, and they're like, we need Obama to sign off on it because you're basically going to be the next president. And he was like, no, they're like, I'm going to make the decision when I get in there. So, there was a very specific, yeah, like, yeah, that whole, the way that all played out really sort of revealed the degree to which finance capital owns, the entire country and, the entire world economy. Um,
Yeah, and yeah, and I want to segue to this scorecard, but just to kind of transition, this is a I mean, we kind of started in the end saying that, we're the antidote to black liberalism. And by that I mean
blah, blah.
like by that I mean like, particularly what's been really kind of fashionable nowadays, particularly since I think Black Lives Matter, is to use racial justice rhetoric to basically I always consider it's a lot of it is racial justice rhetoric to show that you're in solidarity with black people and people of color. But I think a lot of times that rhetoric is a lot of is just is kind of a lot of times it could just be pure hot air and lacking in like political economic analysis. So I want to draw our attention to. So I saw this racial justice scorecard, and just to be
Yeah.
clear, I don't want to come across as besmirching the work that
Who,
nonprofits in general
yeah.
do.
Who is this? The
Yeah, so this is
Center for
the
Urban and
Center
Racial Equality,
or Equity. Yeah,
Equity.
so yeah, Center for Urban and Racial Equity. So this is not to like totally trash the organization, but I do think the reason why I wanted to discuss this is because I think this scorecard shows the limitations of the current racial justice rhetoric that's pretty prominent, particularly in this election. So they have this scorecard and it says, where do the presidential candidates stand on racial justice? Now, and I'll read their little kind of quick blurb. So they say the next president should have a plan to address racial inequities, dismantle structural racism, and work meaningfully with our communities to push for racial justice. The 2020 racial justice presidential candidate scorecard summarizes the presidential candidate's policy proposals through a racial equity lens across key areas including criminal justice reform, education, healthcare, voting rights, reparations, environmental justice, immigration, indigenous rights, and policies to close the racial wealth gap. We are offering this scorecard to elevate racial equity in the candidate selection process and to help voters who care about racial justice make an informed decision in 2020. Now, my reaction to this wasn't like my initial reaction is wasn't quite with what the organization is trying to do, because I do think in general it's good to hold candidates accountable on issues of structural racism. But what initially struck me was like the people I know who shared it, who care about racial justice, and the sense I got from them, right, was so I'll go through the rankings. So they have rankings. So Elizabeth Warren got an A minus, 91 out of 100.
A student for that's who loves Elizabeth Warren. All the A students.
Yep. And then Bernie Sanders got a B plus, 88 out of 100.
Ooh.
Pete Buttigieg, B plus, 86 out of 100. Which,
Yeah.
as a teacher, I feel like an 86 out of 100 is normally a B. But uh, anyway,
Yeah.
because yeah, I think 86 out of 100 is normally a B, but he got a B plus. But whatever. Anyway, Amy Klobuchar, she got a C, 73.5 out of 100. Tom Steyer, D, 67.5 out of 100. Joe Biden, D, 61.5 out of 100. Michael Bloomberg, F, 55.25 out of 100. Tulsi Gabbard, F, 55 out of 100. Donald Trump, F, 4.75 out of
He
100.
wrote his name on the test.
Yeah, it is. I guess people. I guess they want to hold all the candidates accountable. But I feel like someone like Donald Trump, like, why even put him on here? Because it's like he's like there's nothing
Yeah. Just
like
just for
like
the lulz.
yeah, it's not even worth pretending he's anywhere close to promote. Anyway, so the when I saw people share this, the sort of um, argument they were putting forward, right? Because they were using this scorecard, I think, to make a certain argument, right? It wasn't like, oh, here's this scorecard, judge the candidates on your own. It was like, oh, look at this racial justice scorecard. Elizabeth Warren is the best on racial justice. And I was like, okay, hold up. Like, let's put the brakes before we start making that kind of claim, right? Um,
Yeah.
so uh, before I go on, like, Peter, what was your reaction like when you saw this?
Um.
When I sh-
Well, yeah. I opened the whole thing. So I've got like the 50-page white paper in front of me, and
Mhm.
I mean, I this is the kind of thing that I actually think, yeah, can be beneficial on the left, because this is the kind of shit the right does, where they like, you know, or like they'll grade you, and then you want to get a certain grade, so that you have to hold these positions. But I think like there's definitely some fudging in terms of the way the way they're assessing things. The
Yeah,
main difference between, basically, it's three. Elizabeth Warren beat Bernie Sanders by 3 points, and all of that 3 points comes from the racial wealth gap slash housing category, which is divided into three categories: housing, labor, and wealth. Um, and For housing and labor, they Bernie gets all the marks for, because he wants to, because he wants to like actually build more public housing, like a lot more, which for the record is the only way we solve the housing affordability crisis. Like, you
yes,
can't just give a bunch of tax breaks to developers and then allow them to build a bunch of shitty condos and then hope the rent comes down. Yeah, also he
yeah,
wants national rent control. And it says he vows to make Section 8 available to all eligible families without a wait list, which is, I think, pretty major.
yeah,
$15 minimum wage, federal jobs guarantee, and all that stuff. But they give him a 0 on wealth. Specifically, it says it does not outline a policy plan to build wealth in communities of color. And Elizabeth Warren gets a full marks in that. Um, and her great plans to build wealth in communities of color is to promote more investment in activities that help low and moderate, or help credit worthy borrowers find affordable mortgages. Um, so she proposes investing $2 billion to support underwater borrowers, build more economic security, is a with a and have a first time homebuyer down payment assistance program for low income people who have lived in formerly redlined or segregated neighborhoods. Um, and the other thing that I guess they give her all the marks for is she would create a new small business equity fund and a new Department of Economic Development to help entrepreneurs of color. So if you kind of drill into that, it's really like, for the for the all the points she gets, it's really just kind of the basic like home owning sort of neoliberal stuff that Democrats have been promising forever. But it doesn't really. I mean, you know, whatever. I'll just say it because I don't. And if someone wants to write a 10-page email why I'm wrong, then they can do that. But that kind of stuff does not really fundamentally change the system. It does, or doesn't change like the material reality so much. It's just like it's you know like promoting entrepreneurship doesn't really, it's not really a guarantee that it builds wealth in the way that will specifically in a way that will reduce the wealth gap.
Yeah,
Let's just keep it 100, right? If what you want to do is reduce the wealth gap, then maybe redistribute some of the wealth, right?
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So this, yeah, so this is, I'm glad you said it because I think what you pointed out, I think, so a lot of people have been saying like, hey, Sanders and Warren, they pretty much had the same policies. So why don't the Sanders supporters just support Warren? And I think what Peter just pointed out is there is a real, I think, fundamental distinct difference between Warren and Sanders in terms of their analysis and orientation towards capitalism, right? So Warren is progressive, but to the furthest extent within working within the confines of capitalism. And I think that's what you're
Yeah,
seeing in her policies being enumerated there. Like that's the furthest edge you can go in terms of working within capitalism to address racial inequality, right? Whereas Sanders is basically he's advancing policies that basically kind of go outside the capitalist framework. And so like yeah, when it comes to redistributing wealth, well, okay, one approach is like, okay, build wealth from bottom up, black businesses, stuff like that. But that takes a while. Another approach could just be like, well, have redistributive tax policies that tax the wealthy at a high amount and redistribute that money back downward. And that's another way you could
yeah.
address the wealth gap. And
I
so yeah,
mean,
if you have those kinds of tax policies that could have a that would have a real material benefit to black and brown communities. And I think Warren, and that's where you see with Warren is that like when it comes to those kinds of tax policies, and even with Medicare for all, she sort of hedges on that because remember, initially she was for Medicare for all, right?
yeah,
And then she backpedaled on that. She
she's
backpedaled.
like she wants to officially, which is like, look, guys, anytime someone starts breaking up legislation in Congress, that just means that they're kicking the can down the road. They don't intend to actually pass anything. It's the same thing with immigration reform because that the whole thing was like, Republicans were like, we're going to do it piecemeal, which means more border militarization now, and then maybe we'll get to legalizing people. And it's the same thing where it's like, we'll do a little bit now, so that like it'll help my polling, but the actual thing that everyone agrees we have to do, we'll do that in like 10 years or something. And it's based on this idea that like, oh, well, that's how long it takes, which is all that's crap. Like the state, when it really wants to, can do a lot of things very quickly, and it can
I
take
mean,
a yeah, it can take
look
a
how look, yeah. I mean, sorry to cut you up, but like, I mean,
uh,
just I'll just bring up this example. Look how quickly it takes us to start a war, right?
mhm.
It doesn't take us that long to mobilize the armed forces to start a war in another country.
we
Um,
can we can move the entire basically the entire army in 40 or anywhere in the world in 48 hours.
yeah, look, I mean, it took months to topple. I mean, it took weeks to topple Saddam Hussein in Iraq, right?
Yeah,
It took months to basically topple Gaddafi in Libya, right?
yeah,
And even during during World War II, it didn't take that long to mobilize the state for to shift the economy to a war based economy, which played even bigger role in getting the U.S. out of the Great
yeah,
Depression, probably even more so than the New Deal, right? The state was mobilized to do the New Deal. So yeah, like when the state wants to do something, it can do it. So this idea that like, oh, you have to wait 5 million years before you get single payer healthcare. Yeah, that's a farce.
yeah. and
That's a total farce.
And I mean, the point I always try to make to people about the difference between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren is basically like Warren is running as a technocrat, as someone who has a lot of great plans, very well thought out, well written plans, printed on very nice paper. Um, and she's going to get in there and she's going to do them, and they will be done, and then we'll get back to to whatever weird vision of America you thought was amazing in 2010 or whatever. And there's this little problem called Mitch McConnell, right? And
And the
so,
Republican
yeah,
Party he represents.
and it's like every single Democrat knows this, and I've yet to see how you know Elizabeth Warren or you know anyone else, Biden or Pete or Klobuchar, how they are going to solve that problem. Bernie, you can maybe disagree with whether or not it will be entirely effective, but at least he has an idea of popular mobilization to shift the ground that will shift the political window, and that's really you're not going to be able to work with these people, the Republican Party. And even if you take back the Senate, which we're probably not going, oh my god, I'm telling on myself, the Democrats are probably not going to do.
I'll go. So, like, my critiques of this scorecard, which I think again, it really isn't about the organization itself, but I think it kind of shows the limitations of liberal thinking when it comes to addressing issues that impact Black people and people of color. So one of my issues was, so in another part of their methodology. So like Peter, I have their methodology of their scorecard in front of me. So they have on record, rhetoric, and so 5 points.
Oh yeah, that one.
Y-
That was
Yes,
like them putting their thumb on the scale. Except I think
yes,
Bernie got an 8, and also Elizabeth Warren got an 8.
yeah.
Um,
So historic support is
it was
5
weird.
points. So this is that to me I felt like was a red flag in terms of this methodology,
Yeah,
because if you're trying to assess candidates on racial justice, it's not enough to look at their platform, because any candidate can say anything on their platform, particularly during an election. And so now you're in an election environment where, yeah, I think people are a lot more sensitive to race issues now, especially with someone like Donald Trump in office. And I think, Black Lives Matter, what it did, it made a lot of guilty white liberals sort of a little bit more like on their P's and Q's when it comes to race, right? So you're going to see
yeah,
like white politicians do their best to kowtow to Black voters and try to say all the right woke and race buzzwords in order to get the Black vote. So that
um,
is going to sound all fine and dandy on the surface of it, but for me, in my opinion, I think someone's historic record when it comes to racial justice, that deserves a higher count in this kind of methodology. Because, and I think if you were to put that, then I think this count might look a little bit different. So Joe Biden got a D because,
I also just want to jump in because it's in
yeah.
that category, and this is the thing
Hmm.
that really kind of makes me upset at the last thing, the last sentence in Warren's. Um, yeah, they do all the thing. I mean, her whole Native American fakery thing is really,
Yep.
it is honestly, for the intersectional crew, it is extremely bad, and I don't
Yeah.
understand how they can just give her a pass on it. But I
They
want to,
they yeah,
yeah,
they were, sorry to cut you off, but like, yeah,
oh
like that. I'm glad you brought that up, because that like, if you're gonna say that you care about racial justice, right, and especially someone like Warren, who's doing a pretty good job of saying the right stuff. She's doing a really
yeah,
good job of saying the right stuff. But if that's your concern, to address structural racism, it's a huge red flag when a white person has spent much of their
yeah,
career
when
passing themselves off
yeah,
as Native
yes,
American
yes, while
and
while
and
Bernie
getting
wasn't,
job
yeah,
sorry, and getting job benefits that were meant for Native Americans when you're not
yeah,
Native American. That's a huge red flag. So if someone is going forth saying, I'm in solidarity with people of color, blah blah blah, but it's like, wait a minute, for much of your career, um, you lied and said you're a Native American, and well, maybe not lie, but like, because people are,
I
are
mean,
probably going to be like, she knew, she thought she
she
knew, and da da
she
da, but it's
she
like,
heavily she deep tissue massaged the truth.
Yes, there you go. Yeah, because last time I checked, like is because the thing about any kind of racial identity, like you have to be assimilated into a community to really claim it. And as far as I know, like d- I haven't seen any indication to show that like Elizabeth Warren herself has fully assimilated herself into any particular Native American
No, I mean
tribe or nation.
I mean blood quantum's a very controversial subject that I'm not going to get into, but it's like
Right. Yeah.
when it
Yeah.
comes to
Let's
it's
avoid that.
like you either are or not a member of the nation, right? It's not,
Right. And there's
but
tribal membership and all
yeah,
that. So,
but I just want to get to the last sentence where it says she's offered a plan to address Black maternal deaths and has highlighted the experiences of Black women, workers, and activists during the campaign, whatever that means. Um,
mhm,
Elizabeth Warren's plan to address maternal mortality is very, very questionable because it's
mm,
basically like the No Child Left Behind model, where, like, basically they're going to threaten to close underperforming hospitals if they don't meet this scorecard or whatever. Which, like,
mm.
I mean, No Child Left
Whoa.
Behind, like,
Wow.
decimated like school systems, and
Yeah, it did.
that's exactly the kind of neoliberal plan making that, like, is bad. And, like, it's like, no, that's a bad plan. That's not a plan that should exist. And also, like, the experience, I mean, highlighting the experiences of, you know that's a that doesn't mean anything. I don't know what that means, but I will say that while Warren is doing that, Bernie, in Iowa, was campaigning for the right of home healthcare workers to unionize. And that is much more like intersectional, in the sense of, like, that's a predominantly woman of color field where, like, you know, that will, you know, like, that's a material improvement in their lives. It's not listening and acknowledging people's experiences. That's something that can materially improve people's lives. And all of Bernie's plans are centered around that. They aren't centered around, you know, how good it looks on paper.
Yeah, and like let's make a distinction between listening to the voices of marginalized people versus material benefit. Look, you could like a white like, listening to people of color. What material impact does it have on the day to day lives of people of color? Because a white person can listen to, let's say, any kind of really fucked up story about a black person's encounter with like police violence, but that doesn't translate into actually changing anything about the situation at hand. It doesn't stop the rampant police violence from happening in the first place. So you can listen all you want. That doesn't improve someone's lives on a day to day basis. So yeah, like there's a distinction. I mean, it's yes, listen to marginalized communities and their experiences, but there's a step you have to take beyond that. Listening's not just enough.
Yeah,
There has to
I
be
mean the
actual yeah,
the NSA is listening all the time to everyone.
right.
So,
Another thing I want to bring up, and this is one another like huge red flag. Not really just particularly with this scorecard, but the whole discussion. They brought up reparations, right? So I want to like let's make it clear. Just as a journalist, I want to fact check this. Okay,
yeah.
the only presidential candidate who supported reparations in the sense of coming up with a proposed policy to implement reparations is Marianne Williamson.
Yeah.
No one else has done that. Cory Booker came out with baby bonds. Okay, that's fine, but that's not
Wait,
reparations. That's not that's a
what's that? I didn't even know what
it's
that is.
basic. Baby bonds is basically like to kind of sum it up. You're essentially when children are born, you basically from the day that they're born, you give them like a bond, and like it's
So a
supposed
trust
to
fund for
grow.
everyone.
Kind of, yeah. So which is like, and that's supposed to close the racial wealth gap, and it's like,
My
oh,
God.
okay, but that's not
No,
reparations.
that's
That's
like,
not the same thing as
it
reparations.
doesn't matter if, like, if every Black person makes an extra $5,000 a year, if, like, that's not going to close the wealth gap if white
It's the
billionaires are, raking in money are earning an extra $5 billion a year, right? Like,
It's the UBI equivalent of
yeah,
reparations. That's basically what it is. It's the baby bonds is like a universal basic income version of reparations. So I want to make that clear. No candidate has put forward an actual policy to implement reparations. What they're really, and I looked at the scorecards, so they gave most of the candidates got 7 out of 10 for reparations, and what they based it on was largely their support for HR 40. And for those of you who don't know, HR 40 is a bill in Congress, and the bill is basically to create a commission to study and propose reparations. It's not to implement reparations. So let's make this
no,
clear.
that's not happening.
H, HR 40 is to support the study of
Yeah,
reparations. So basically, and this is what Warren signed. Warren basically announced that she supports HR 40. So basically, people like Warren are saying that they support the study of
yeah,
reparations, not the implementation of reparations, because you can say you support studying reparations, but whether or not you want to actually implement reparations in whatever form it is, that's completely different. And someone could say, like, yeah, I support the study of reparations, but then when it comes time to actually implement reparations and actually look at, like, yeah, let's actually look at how much money a lot of wealthy white people made off of slavery, when it comes time to hand in that invoice and start cashing out that payment, then they could be like, oh, you know what? We're not going to do that. That's too much. Because here's the reality: that the entire U.S. economy was based on slavery. There are several institutions, from banks to individuals to
insurance.
major
Basically,
insurance
all
companies.
insurance, like the entire insurance industry, was born out of insuring slaves.
The stock market, the Wall Street was a slave trading market. So the entire modern capitalist system we have today exists because of slavery. So once you start really thinking about reparations, once you start going down that rabbit hole, you're going to really have to question the foundation of the economy that we live in. So when you want to seriously start addressing reparations, you're going to have to tackle that system. And when it comes time to tackling that, I
We're
highly doubt any of these candidates would have
not even
the
Bernie.
guts to do that. Not even Bernie Sanders. And here's the thing about Sanders: at least he's consistent. Like, he's consistent about, like he's at least a little bit honest in the sense that, like, how are you going to do it? And that was his stance. So I don't
Yeah,
agree with
I
his
mean,
his stance, but he's consistent. I'll give him that. He's consistent.
it
I'll
was
give him that.
also just like people were ambushing him. I mean, that whole
Yeah.
thing was stupid, and it was just another. I mean, they're always trying to get him off message, which is what you do in a campaign. Um, everything. If you're wondering why they're going at him with just like the stupidest shit imaginable, like, it doesn't matter that it's stupid. The point is just that there's just a new thing every week that he has to talk about that isn't Medicare for all. That isn't his actual policies, and that's how that campaign cycle works.
And that's reparations is one of those
Yeah.
tactics. So it's like, okay, Bernie doesn't outright say he supports reparations. Therefore, so the discussion goes from Bernie Sanders' response is like, well, how are you going to pay out reparations? What are you going to do? It goes from that to basically, oh, Bernie Sanders does not support reparations. Then it gets to, okay, Bernie is against black people. And then Elizabeth
Right.
Warren says, well, technically what she said was, I support HR 40, I support the study of reparations, racism is bad, blah, 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 blah. That's like, oh, okay, Elizabeth Warren supports reparations, which, again, she did not support reparations. She supports the study of
Yeah.
reparations. It's not the same thing as implementing reparations. And I feel like I have to say this again and again and again. It is not supporting reparations and supporting the study of reparations are two separate things. Every candidate supports the study of reparations. The only candidate who supported reparations in the sense of actually coming out with a plan to pay out and implement reparations was Marianne Williamson, right? So
I
that
heard
just
I heard
that
Steyer is like kind of on board with it.
yeah. I mean, well, he
Whatever.
he, he wants to be Bernie's friend, so that he Tom
Which
Star
is
is lonely.
which
That's
is
just what it
it's
is.
so
He's just
dumb.
like, he wants people to like him. He's like, hey Bernie, what's up? Bernie's like,
He's like
whatever, I don't
like have
care.
you did you not just hear me spend like I've been spending the last 4 years talking about how terrible billionaires are. Like what do you think, what do you think's going on, Tom?
Yeah.
So we're basically at an hour. Um,
Yeah.
do we
So
wanna?
y-
Yeah, I guess let's. I guess we can start wrapping up.
yeah, so yeah,
Explain maybe explain some of our plans for the future for this pod.
yeah, so yeah, so that was, I mean, just to, I'll just wrap so to start, I'll wrap up our discussion on this scorecard, but I one of the reasons why I wanted to bring up this scorecard is to um kind of just have an actual retort to the common discourse on racial justice, and particularly how it's being used in this election cycle. And I think for anyone who says they support racial justice, and I don't want to go into questioning people's motivations, but it's like, hey, if you're someone
I
who
I have a question of what racial justice even means anymore.
you know what, actually, let's talk about that. I don't care, we'll go a couple extra minutes. Who cares, let's go a couple extra minutes, because yeah, actually, I'm glad you said that, because okay, what is racial justice? So Peter, what do you think racial justice is? Because I have
um,
my opinion.
as someone who's grew up in the social justice tradition, let's say that's what the Unitarian Church is like. I suppose it's just like an idea of equity and fairness. That this current state of being, the current state of affairs is unfair for this group of people, and so we need to do things to make it fair. Um, I don't ever understand like when that is accomplished. Like what state of affairs in the liberal framework would be what where would we get to where justice is achieved? When has that happened in history where there is an injustice, you know, of committed, and then like we did some liberal thing and then now there was justice, right? So
Mhm.
that's my beef. That's my main beef. The other thing is that justice is just like a buzzword, and so now there's, instead of just talking about housing, it's housing justice. Instead of just talking about food access, it's food justice, and everything justice. And it's like, what is, and I don't it just doesn't mean anything. It's like, and the third thing is that like I think people forget like there are different kinds of justice, and maybe like Old
Yeah.
Testament justice is what's called for in some situations. Swift and merciless. I'm just saying, like justice as a concept isn't always this nice, um, you know, noble, honorable, friendly thing. I mean, it's about evening the scales. Like the balance has been upset, and you have to restore that balance, and that doesn't always mean like through nice ways. So that's my, I guess, little soapbox on that.
I When I think of racial justice, like I like to think more in terms of um, black liberation than justice. So what I mean
Yeah.
by that is, um, I think there's this meme or this picture where it's like there's this I think like this baseball game, and there's a fence and there's people of
Oh
different
yeah.
heights. Yeah, so like the tallest person, no matter what, can see over the fence. The person who's mid height needs like one box to see it, to see over the fence. Then there's the shortest person who needs two boxes to see over the fence. And so it seems like the conventional sort of discourse on racial justice is like, okay, just give this the short medium height person one box and the shortest person two boxes to see over that fence. And my thing is, well, get rid of the fence so that
Yeah.
everyone can
Right.
see it.
Yeah.
Right. So I like to think of racial justice in terms of black liberation, in the sense of like we need to be free of the system that keeps us in a state of oppression, and in a state where we can never achieve full human dignity. And so for me, it's like, what does it look like when people are truly free and can be truly free, dignified human beings in a world where you don't have systems where there's such that produces massive inequality, endless war, violence. So for me, the real question is like, how do we liberate ourselves from that system, and how do we chip away at that system to get us to the goal of liberation. And to me, what it seems like a lot of the rhetoric when it comes to racial justice, a lot of it, I think they don't say it outright, but I think it's sort of subtle and assumed. They assume that there's no future beyond the current state of affairs, which would basically mean like there's no future for black people outside of American capitalism. So it's like we kind of have to make do with the economic state of affairs as is. You just kind
Yeah.
of make it a little bit more comfortable, but you're not fully going to challenge the system or get rid of it and replace it with something new. And for me, the real question is like, how do you get rid of the current system as it is and replace it with something far more better for humane, not just for black people, but for every human being on the planet. And especially with the
Yeah.
climate crisis, that's something we're going to have to think about, because we're at the point where it's like we have very little time when it comes to the survival of the human species on this planet. So we have to start asking these big questions. And I think like the current discourse on racial justice, and this is kind of where I feel frustrated, is that its limitations of what justice looks like is very, very limited, but it's dressed up in a way where it seems very radical when like you actually dig into the nitty gritty of it. It's not that radical. So, and I think like
Yeah.
that's the reason why I want to show this scorecard, because I think to me that shows like the limitations of the current liberal progressive woke thinking on race. And
Yeah.
another thing I want to mention is that
Cause,
I
cause,
my cons-
oh, I just,
so I'll just finish with this last point.
okay.
Then, yeah. Just but for racial justice, one thing I do want to mention, it was definitely left out of the scorecard, is foreign policy, because a lot of our
Mm,
wars impact black and brown people overseas. Our drone strikes hit Iraq, like Somalia, Yemen, Libya. We've been threatening a war with Iran. We had a war in Iraq that lasted almost 20 years, damn near destroyed the country, killed hundreds of thousands of people.
yeah, but they're
And
not
that's just
Muslim.
that's just in recent U.S. history. I mean, you can go back to the Cold War and the number of coups and CIA interventions, and the
Bodies on
Vietnam War,
bodies.
and the number the sheer amount of bloodshed and dead bodies that are stacked up as a result of the US imperial war machine that has been killing black and brown people overseas. That to me is what I consider a matter of racial justice, because it's not enough to limit racial justice just to the confines of the borders of the United States. You also have to look at what's going on in
And get
Guantanamo, our foreign policy in Latin America, our wars in the Middle East, and on and on and on. So that was absent from that scorecard, which I think was
well,
the major ding.
and guess who loves America's War Machine? I mean,
Everyone,
lots of people, but
a lot of people.
specifically Elizabeth Warren. And
Oh yes.
if you ever bring that up with a Warren supporter, they get pretty quiet pretty quickly. They
Oh
don't
yeah.
like to talk about it. Um,
And Bernie Sanders has been kind of, that's been one of my gripes with Sanders, is especially as someone who's been covering drone
yeah.
strikes in Guantanamo. I really, Sanders has been pretty good on particularly
Well,
challenging just the level of economic inequality in America. That's a huge thing, but he's been very mild when it comes to foreign policy and war, and there are a lot of, I think, very legitimate left critiques of Sanders when it comes
yeah.
to
He
Palestine
he ha-
and foreign
he
policy.
has it easy because he's like the only non-monster in the Senate,
Right,
and
right,
and
right.
so he can just and so like he he he's not someone who he does, and I believe he is sincere about wanting to majorly cut the defense budget, and I am very curious as to how they would ever let him do that. But there's definitely room for improvement on that front with Bernie.
Yeah. And so to wrap up, yeah, because it's over an hour. So to wrap up, yeah, I think this is sort of just our first episode. I think other episodes, we're gonna be covering a number of issues. I mean, I personally would like to do an entire episode on Guantanamo, particularly the history of the U.S. base there, going back to the Spanish American War and even further. So I'd like to. That'll definitely. That's something definitely
Yeah.
want to sort of plan in the future. Um, Other issues like when it comes to our foreign policy, the ongoing police violence in America. Um, and obviously, yeah, it's an election, so we're gonna be
I really hope we
reacting to
don't
it.
have to talk about the election in the sense that
Yeah,
like there isn't, but I know there can. It's only going to get worse. There's a lot more bullshit to come, and part of I mean, part of the reason we're doing this is so that we can say this out loud instead of just yelling to ourselves.
yeah,
um,
right.
so
We'll just
I
yell at you guys.
yeah,
We'll just
I
yell in the
definitely
microphone.
have a lot of. I mean, I always get ambitious plans with projects, but I think what I really want to do, one thing I really want to do with this is highlight, the actual class divides within Black America, um,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah,
is something that people do not like to talk about. Um,
yeah,
so, and get into also a lot of the like, sort of political economy aspects, of how Black America is situated in the world as, basically an underdeveloped country and understanding
right.
it as such. Um, I also, you know, I would like to do more, talk about African politics and African affairs more.
Yeah,
Eventually we'll talk about China, I'm sure. Get into, I think, in a lot of the bonus stuff, get into some of a lot of the history of liberation, Black liberation. There's so many books that like I either have read and want to, and are essays I want to revisit, or basically use this podcast as an excuse to read them. So,
yeah.
um,
I
it'll be a lot
yeah,
of good stuff. So people really should subscribe and stick around because we'll be giving you like the real theory, real Marxist shit. We won't soft pedal it, and we won't hide behind like liberal obfuscations. I mean, so that's my sales
yeah,
pitch.
yeah. And to piggyback off of that, like as a like I said before, I'm a Pan Africanist, and so I want to kind of get into the sort of the history of Pan Africanism because I think there are some misconceptions about what it is, and like we're called the Real Sankara Hours. We named it after
Yeah.
Thomas Sankara, so
I
I
just
think
watched The Upright Man in preparation for this.
yeah,
It was great. People, we got to do an episode on that for sure.
yeah, yeah. We'll do an episode on Thomas Sankara because he's a very I think underappreciated figure in global Black liberation. And yeah, Peter and I were talking earlier about the class dynamics within the Black community, and that's something I'm pretty sure is might be a
Hmm.
recurring theme with us because that's something we talk about a lot. And I will say that I do think some of the obstacles to Black liberation, in my opinion, stem from uh, the politics of the so-called Black misleadership class. So
Or
and I
the
also
Black
and I also
agenda
think like
report.
yeah, and also think like there are certain discussions about Black politics and even class and Black America that honestly get left out of white left spaces because yeah, like I mean we're all left and we're all blah blah blah, but it's like like Peter and I are coming from very different experiences as we announced earlier, and so like a lot of times like our perspectives and in history and traditions oftentimes get overlooked in white dominated left spaces. So that's a gap we want to fill because there's a lot of intellectual history and tradition that matter today then that needs to be
Yeah.
dived be
The
delved into. So yeah, so look, be on the lookout for that. Um, Anything else you want to say, Peter? Or should we just
um
close out?
drinking Colt 45.
Oh, nice. Um, I'm drinking fucking hazy IPA. I'm almost done with it. It's the last one I have. Um,
What kind?
yeah.
Is
Hold
it
on.
the Sierra Nevada?
Yeah, I just want to get some cheap stuff at
Yeah.
Safeway, so
All
I had
right.
a six
Yeah.
pack
Okay.
of it.
Let's stop this. Then we.
All right, cool.
All right.
Peace. Hey everyone, Adam here. I hope you liked our first episode. That was the first episode of our podcast, Real Sankara Hours. We were talking about this racial justice scorecard that was scoring each candidate on racial justice. It's something I've been seeing a lot of progressive friends of mine pass around. And toward the end, Peter and I were discussing reparations because one of the issues that they addressed in the scorecard to give a final score for each candidate on racial justice was reparations. So the total score was 100. Reparations, their stance on reparations, the total possible they could have got was 10. So 10 out of 100. That's pretty important. So um, and I think there was a lot of there's been a lot of obfuscation and confusion between supporting the study of reparations versus supporting the implementation of reparations. And so far, a lot of the candidates who've been saying that they support reparations, you have to read between the lines because a lot of it really hinges on their support for HR 40, which is a bill to study reparations. So there's some conflation between supporting reparations and studying reparations. So for example, um, for their for this scorecard's methodology, what they say for Warren, and I'm pulling it up right here. This is their 50-page kind of white paper on like their methodology and the details of. It's like a detailed breakdown of each candidate, their stance on the issue, and the sort of the numbers they get on each thing. So Warren gets 7 out of 10. It says Warren has expressed strong support for reparations, and that largely hinges on, again, her support for HR 40, which is, again, to support the study of reparations, which is different than supporting reparations. Someone can support the study of reparations, but then change their mind when it comes time to actually implement reparations. Which, again, like if you really think seriously about reparations, you're going to have to think really carefully about the foundation of the American economy. And so once you go down that rabbit hole, I highly doubt like any of these candidates would be willing to go that far to truly implement reparations. So anyway, um, even for Klobuchar, she also got a 7 out of 10. But there is this Hill article where essentially she said, let me pop it up right here. Where she said is yes, this Hill article where Klobuchar basically says um, she was asked about reparations. This was last year. This is March 17th, 2019. And when asked about reparations, Klobuchar said she supports investing in those communities that have been so hurt by racism. And then she also said that it doesn't have to be a direct pay for each person. Then she added, but what we can do is invest in those communities, acknowledge what's happened, making sure we have that shared dream of opportunity for all Americans. So this is very vague because reparations is specifically for the descendants of enslaved Africans in America, right? That's a very, very particular plight that is a lot more specific than just being hurt by racism because there are a lot of other communities of color that have been hurt by racism. But when you're talking about African Americans, like our plight is different in the sense that like we were brought here involuntarily from Africa as slaves to the United States. And so reparations is supposed to essentially repair the damage of centuries long pain caused by slavery, racism, Jim Crow. So her response, I think, is like it sounds nice on paper, but it's incredibly vague, and it doesn't get to the issue at hand, which is again reparations for slavery, and also investing in communities like that's. I mean that again, that sounds vague. Like that doesn't sound like well, how what how does that translate to an actual reparations policy. So it seems like they're taking this sort of fairly vague answer Klobuchar is giving on reparations and then giving her a 7 out of 10, which I think is pretty generous. So when I was looking through this, I felt like, okay, they're giving them 7 out of 10, which I think is pretty generous on fairly mild stances on reparations, right? So what I did is I rescored. So what I did was I gave, those five candidates 1 out of 10 on the issue of reparations because I felt like they're just kind of doing a very, very, very bare minimum, right? To me, it would make more sense to like, okay, look at each candidate's plan to actually implement reparations and then kind of score from there, right? And again, like their statements, like to say that they support reparations, I think is being very, very generous and misleading for a lot of people, honestly, because I've noticed there are a lot of, I think, well-meaning people who say they support racial justice and say they support reparations, but it's like you really have to think through like what you actually mean when it comes to saying you support reparations. So that's why I gave them each a 1 out of 10 because I think it's important to have a high standard when it comes to reparations. So um, I rescored for five of the candidates, the top five candidates: Warren, Sanders, Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Steyer. They each get 1 out of 10 on reparations. So that basically means I looked at their top score. I subtracted 6 points from each because to go from 7 to 1, that's subtract 6. So I just deducted 6 points from their respective scores. And the end result is interesting, and it's something I want to highlight. So for Warren, based on my scoring, what I did, she goes down from an A minus of 91 over 100 to 85 over 100, which is basically a B. So according to my score, Warren gets a B. Sanders, he goes down from 82 over 100, which is a B plus, down to Sanders gets it. He what he has is an 88 on there, so he has an 88 out of 100 on their scorecard, which is a B plus, and he goes down to an 82 over 100 based on my scoring, which is basically like a B minus around there, like basically I would say like B minus, something like that. Buttigieg, he has a B plus, 86 over 100 on their scorecard. On mine, he gets 80 over 100, which is a B minus. Klobuchar, on theirs, she has a C, which is a 73.5 out of 100. Based on my scoring, she goes down to a 67.5 out of 100, which is, yeah, a D. So Klobuchar goes from a C to a D. And Steyer, he has a D on theirs, 67.5 out of 100. And he goes down to, based on my scoring, a 60.5, which is like basically a D minus, borderline F. So when I rescored it, as you can tell, none of these candidates got A's or A minuses. So I think that's something to think about because I thought the way they were grading on reparations was pretty generous, and it seemed like to me that they were grading on a curve, a very generous curve, and I think that curve really has had an impact on this scorecard and how it looks. And so, when you look at Warren and Sanders in particular, like you're going from a B to like a B/B minus, which is like that's pretty close. I mean, A minus to B plus is pretty close too, but like, when you look on paper, A minus looks a lot better than a B plus, right? So, if you're a student in class, you'd be pretty sure you'd be a lot happier getting an A minus versus a B plus, right? So, yeah, based on my scoring, none of these candidates got A's. And I just did this kind of like just as an experiment, but I thought it was a really interesting experiment because, um, again, I thought this scoring was really generous, and I think by seriously, reading between the lines on an issue like reparations and anything connected to institutional racism, uh, I think it's really important to hold candidates to a much higher standard than the current discourse does. So, again, based on my scoring, none of them get A's. And I think particularly for people during this election cycle who are, post Black Lives Matter, the issue of racism is kind of on people's minds, especially with Trump in office. So, if you're going to use a scorecard like this to show like, hey, my candidate's better than yours on racial justice, I think it's really important to read between the lines on that. So anyway, that ends this addendum to this episode. Stay tuned for more episodes of Real Sankara Hours. Peace.